Thank you very much, Xoli, and I'll take you straight back to the United Nations Security Council. Deliberations are being held there to deal with issues around enforcement on the International Court of Justice's ruling on Israel. So let's take you back there now.
Justice stated that Israel is obliged to take all measures in its power to prevent and punish such action. Finally, it is urgent to avoid regional conflagration. The stability of Lebanon and the region requires the full compliance with Resolution 1701 by all parties and with the assistance of UNIFIL. France will contribute to creating the conditions for lasting de-escalation in that regard. France will continue to shoulder its responsibilities to contribute to maritime security in the Red Sea. I thank you.
I now resume my duties as the President of the Security Council, and I give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Algeria for requesting this meeting in follow-up to the ICJ order in the case brought forward by South Africa against Israel on genocide. Allow me to renew our profound thanks to South Africa for its moral leadership and for this initiative that has received overwhelming support from peoples and governments across the globe. And the last one was the summit in Kampala. 120 countries of the NAM unanimously welcomed this effort by South Africa. Allow me also to thank USG Martin Griffiths for his sobering briefing on the worst man-made, occupation-made humanitarian catastrophe in modern history, and for his relentless efforts and those of the Secretary General and UN in general, notably its humanitarian personnel on the ground, to bring an end to this catastrophe. Mr. President, the ICJ has offered a resounding rebuke to those who claimed that the case of genocide against Israel was meritless and baseless. The court also dismissed the premise that somehow Israel, by its very nature, would be above the law and could not be accused of committing the crime of genocide. To those with misplaced outrage by the crime, to those with misplaced outrage, be outraged by the crime, not the accusation, by reality on the ground, not the words to describe it. Enough racism and supremacy, enough impunity. Show humanity now, as the court found that the rights of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is to be protected from acts of genocide, attempted genocide, incitement to commit genocide, complicity in genocide, and conspiracy to commit genocide are plausible. That plausibility that a genocide is actually underway, not that the accusation of genocide against Israel, is what should keep us all up at night. And I advise all of my colleagues, including some, who were so much attached to what was not on the provisional measures, concentrate on the 6 provisional measures adopted. Do not be more royalist than the king. Even the ad hoc judge of Israel voted in favor of these 2 provisional measures. Read it, study it, and reread it to know what's in it, not what the illusions in the minds of some of what was not in it. It is crystal clear that the provisional measures adopted by the court are binding, and Israel must comply with them. Mr. President, Madam President, sorry. For a while now, everybody has recognized that Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Whether they used these words or not, through its massive indiscriminate bombing with no parallel in modern history, the forcible displacement of the population, the mass arbitrary arrest, the summary execution, including women and children raising the white flag, having a death squad storm a hospital in Jenin, disguised as civilians, as patients, as medical personnel, as a disabled person, as a mother holding a baby, to execute 3 men, including a wounded, partially paralyzed man receiving treatment. If anybody thinks that such behavior is acceptable.
The voice there of Riyad Mansour, the permanent observer of the state of Palestine. We are going to take you straight back to the United Nations Security Council meeting in just a moment. But I would love to welcome our SABC 3 viewers to this live broadcast of events that are happening at the UN Security Council in New York.
For 4 months now, this must end. Mr. President, this Council and the Court have called for protection of civilians. Israel instead is targeting them and persisting with its mass indiscriminate attacks. This Council and the Court have called for allowing the humanitarian assistance to reach the Palestinian population through the Gaza Strip. Israel has instead maintained the siege, orchestrating famine and creating the conditions for spread of dehydration and epidemics, diseases, including among children. This Council and the Court have called to stop incitement for atrocities, crimes, and to hold accountable those responsible for such incitement. Israel instead doubled down. 12 ministers of the Netanyahu government took part in a conference to recolonize Gaza and to get rid of the Palestinians there. The continuation of a long-standing policy of displacement and replacement of the Palestinian people. Hundreds chanting and dancing, celebrating the commission of such crimes. Madam President, the Court upheld its responsibility in its provisional measures. For these provisional measures to be implemented, there has to be a ceasefire, although the burden is in Israel to implement the 6 provisional measures. But you are not assuming your responsibility in adopting a resolution to call for a ceasefire to allow the work and the provisional measures ordered by the court to be implemented. When are you going to act accordingly if you are really serious about respecting your obligations of honoring the ruling of the court? That requires a ceasefire so that Israel can implement, regardless of whether it can or not, it has to implement. But if you want to help Israel, adopt a ceasefire so that it has no excuse not to implement the 6 provisional measures by the court. Madam President, what do we do when atrocities are being committed? When they are not only an integral part of the methods of war used by the occupation power, but its primary policy. We must put an end to them. From day one, we said that this can only be accomplished by a ceasefire. And we keep repeating, ceasefire, ceasefire. The SG, he said, I need 3 things, ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. Martin Griffiths repeat the same thing. Every agency of the United Nations is saying we cannot implement what needs to be implemented without a ceasefire. And yet, the Security Council, after 115 days of this abhorrent, criminal war against our people in the Gaza Strip, is continuing. 15,500 children at least have been killed while we were debating here month after month. Over 26,000 Palestinians have been killed in terrifying circumstances. 2.3 million people have gone through hell every single day for 120 days, and this hell will haunt them long after this assault ends. They are trying to cheat death over and over again, running for safety over and over again, though it is nowhere to be found, until the international community musters the resolve to save them and to stop this war and these atrocities. 13 members of this council have voted for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and 153 member states have supported such a ceasefire in the General Assembly. With now the risk of genocide recognized by the ICJ, it would be criminal not to act to put an end to this war of atrocities. Madam President, Netanyahu said, and I quote, "No one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else," end of quotation. Spoken like a true war criminal, his genocidal words quoted by the court are evil. His genocidal acts are evil. And when the ICC finally decides to uphold its mandate, he should find his place in a jail in The Hague, not in power in Israel. All countries from across the globe have expressed support for an end of the Israeli occupation, Palestinian independence, and the two-state solution. What was the answer of Netanyahu? He bragged about sabotaging peace efforts for decades and for obstructing Palestinian independence and the two-state solution, depriving even his own people of peace and security. This is his agenda, and he has acted upon it for the last 40 years. Madam President, Israel defies the resolutions of the Council, defies the ICJ, the ICC, and it is in an open war against the UN. There is no single country on earth that has campaigned so openly and brazenly against the UN. Why is Israel attacking the UN? We wonder. Because the UN is the source of the evidence of Israel crimes and Israel wants to discredit the witness, to destroy the evidence. Because the UN helps the Palestinian people survive, remain in their land, and Israel wants to uproot them. Because the UN is the forum where Palestinian rights, foremost to self-determination and return, have been recognized, and Israel wants to deny and dissolve these rights. Because the UN has identified the requirements for just and lasting peace, and Israel has chosen ethnic cleansing and genocide instead. Israel has sought the defunding of UN agencies, from UNESCO to UNRWA. It has attacked all the main bodies of the UN, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, ECOSOC, and the ICJ. Its former foreign minister has incited against the Secretary General, and its current foreign minister has accused the Commissioner General of UNRWA of being a supporter of terrorism. An outrageous and despicable claim. Israel has launched campaigns against UN officials, including Lynn Hastings, the SG, and refused to grant visas to representatives of UN bodies as punishment for upholding their mandates. It has, in this assault, killed more than 150 UN staff, the highest number of losses by UN staff since World War II in any conflict. Israel is trying to dismantle any obstacle to its plan to destroy Palestine and the Palestinian people, to forcibly displace them and replace them, to seize full control from the river to the sea, and to implement its supremacist and colonial plans. In dealing with the Israeli allegations against some UNRWA staff, one should never lose sight of these realities and of Israel's stated goal for years now of dismantling UNRWA. And they succeeded one time during the Trump administration of denying funding for UNRWA for more than 3 years. There are serious allegations, and there is a serious investigation. The principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence must be upheld. And it is clear that UNRWA and the Secretary General are committed to these principles, and there is no reason to doubt this commitment. There is no reason to preempt the outcome of the investigation or to take measures that effectively amount to the collective punishment of 30,000 UNRWA staff and millions of refugees, beneficiaries of UNRWA services. UNRWA is the perfect example of the success of the UN. For those who are discovering UNRWA today, in the West, you created UNRWA in 1949 because you had the majority of members in the UN. It's a remarkable success story of multilateralism. We should all of us be proud that we have an organization like UNRWA in the UN system that has been doing a remarkable job in servicing in a humanitarian way the millions of the Palestinian refugees for 75 years. It is our collective duty to protect it, to fund it, to allow it to carry its humanitarian, mandate, especially in these days. Who else is in Gaza from the humanitarian institutions that can implement what you legislated in 2 resolutions in the Security Council, if you do not have the army of the brave 13,000 staff of UNRWA to implement what you want them to do, particularly in distributing and allowing massive amount of humanitarian assistance to get to every corner of the Gaza Strip. But do not fall in the trap of the Israeli government that want to destroy UNRWA. And they made that crystal clear over the years. Defend this brave organization, this fabulous example of multilateralism and the success story of the United Nations. At the time where the Palestinian people are being deliberately deprived of the requirements of life, of what they need for their survival in Gaza, undermining UNRWA would be inhumane, cruel, and irresponsible. Since you all recognize the importance of UNRWA's role and its invaluable contribution, I trust that those who decided to suspend their funding will speedily revise their decision. We appealed to you yesterday, and we supported the appeal of the Secretary General for those to reconsider, because UNRWA deserve to be funded by those who have been doing a great job in funding over so many years, and we always express our gratitude to you for your generosity in funding UNRWA. Madam President, the choice is clear, more than ever. Either allow Israel to dismantle the international law-based order or uphold its rule. It is time to end Israeli impunity, from colonialism to apartheid, from ethnic cleansing to genocide. When is it time to tell Israel enough is enough? The policy of cajoling Israel has brought to power the most openly supremacist and racist government in the history of Israel. Only accountability can help us correct course. Our roadmap is clear. Stop the genocide, ceasefire, justice, freedom, peace. In that order, that is the only pathway from this cruel madness. The Palestinian people deserve nothing less. They will accept nothing else. Justice is what they have been denied for far too long. Freedom is their birthright. Peace is our common goal and horizon. And I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie l'observateur permanent.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. On October 7th, an actual genocidal terrorist organization that openly and proudly declares its genocidal agenda perpetrated actual genocidal acts. That same organization continues to attack Israel, to hold hostages in brutal conditions, and declares regularly its intention to repeat its atrocities again and again and again. And yet none of this has merited serious attention, let alone condemnation by this Council or anything approaching the condemnation and revulsion it should merit in United Nations reports. The message to Israel's citizens and to the hostages, not only from some addressing this Council, but too often from the Council itself, has been, your humanity does not matter to us. You are not deserving of protection. Instead, Madam President, we are witness to an obscene inversion of reality. It is not Hamas that is being charged with genocide. It is not its supporters in Tehran and Pretoria that are being held to account. It is the country that is the victim of Hamas's genocidal campaign that is again and again and again the subject of outrageous accusations, the more extreme the better, that hinge on telling a story in which Hamas, its abuse of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and its utter brutality simply disappear. That this pattern of distorting so-called reality to the Security Council is a matter of routine does not make it morally acceptable, and it only compounds the disconnect between what is so often said in this chamber and what is happening in actual reality. A lie told 1,000 times is not less of a lie. Yes, the civilian suffering in this war to both Israelis and Palestinians is tragic. It is heart-wrenching, but it is impossible to understand this tragedy, much less respond to it, by spinning reality. As Israel stated before the ICJ, Israel is committed, as it must be, to comply with the law, and it does so in the face of Hamas's utter contempt for the law. Israel is committed, as it must be, to demonstrate humanity, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter inhumanity. These commitments are unwavering and exist quite independently of any IJC proceedings. But if Hamas's contempt for the law is never part of the discussion, if its utter inhumanity towards Palestinian civilians as well as Israeli civilians is simply ignored, then we are not dealing with the agonizing reality and the dilemmas that Israel faces, seeking to minimize civilian harm against a lawless terrorist organization that seeks to maximize it. We are dealing with a libel. There is a reason the Palestinian representatives today and the supporters of Hamas, such as South Africa and Algeria, must present so distorted a reality to the Council. It is obvious. For them, the brutal reality created by Hamas does not exist, and indeed cannot exist. For if it did, there would be no possible case of genocide. And the effort to demonize Israel, to tell a story where one side is the victim and the other side is a villain, would collapse. Rather, Israel will be a democratic country exercising its right and duty to defend its citizens under near impossible conditions and from a truly genocidal threat. Madam President, it is hardly surprising that those who have no qualms about distorting the facts have no hesitation about distorting the law. The very attempt to level the charge of genocide against Israel is an outrageous distortion of the Genocide Convention. It is an attempt to empty the word of its unique force and special meaning, and to turn the Convention itself into a tool of terrorists who have total disdain for life and for the law against those trying to defend against them. The same distortion of the law is now being applied in a transparent attempt to twist and misinterpret the decision of the Court on preliminary measures. The Court's decision on provisional measures was issued less than a week ago. The matter is before the Court. The arguments on the merits of the case have not even been heard, let alone decided. Yet already the Council has convened, already the allegations have been levelled, already the abusive and politicised nature of this process has been laid bare. The desperate attempt to ascribe blame is transparent political theatre, a verdict looking for a crime. So it seems appropriate to set the record straight. First, the assertion made with such confidence by the Palestinian representative that the Court has found plausible evidence of genocide is a prime example of this desperate distortion. This is a blatant mischaracterization of the very nature of the provisional measures phase of proceedings, of the term plausibility in the Court's jurisprudence, and of the Court's actual decision. The Court could not have been clearer that it has not and could not make at this preliminary stage any finding on the charge of genocide levelled by South Africa. Israel is confident that South Africa's libel against Israel will be rejected by the ICJ at the merits phase of proceedings. Already it has been widely denounced by numerous states known for their commitment to the rule of law, but the Court at this early phase of proceedings had no authority to make findings on the merits and did not do so. As the Court stated in paragraph 30, and I quote, "At the present stage of the proceedings, the Court is not required to ascertain whether any violations of Israel's obligations under the Genocide Convention have occurred. Such a finding could be made by the Court only at the stage of the examination of the merits of the present case." End of quote. Later, presumably realizing that some may have difficulty understanding this paragraph, the Court reiterated this assertion in paragraph 62 and then again in paragraph 84. It stated, "The decision given in the present proceedings is in no way prejudges the question of the jurisdiction of the Court to deal with the merits of the case or any questions relating to the admissibility of the application or to the merits themselves." End of quote. If the point wasn't clear enough in the decision, Judges Bandari and Nolte in their declarations also left no room for misunderstanding. So much for the claim that South Africa's outrageous and false accusations have been given legitimacy by the Court. Second, the supporters of Hamas genocidal terrorism are similarly and ludicrously trying to assert that the court has called on Israel to cease its military operations. The opposite is the case. In fact, the court unanimously and rightly rejected South Africa's vile attempt to undermine Israel's inherent right to defend itself against the genocidal terrorists of Hamas. Not a single judge suggested otherwise, nor could they have. The very idea that Israel would be denied this fundamental right, while Hamas would be free to continue its terrorist onslaught and hold hostages in brutal captivity, is morally and legally unthinkable. Indeed, by emphasizing that both parties to the conflict are bound by international humanitarian law, the court clearly indicated that it understands that military operations will continue. The egregious provisional measures requested by South Africa were effectively and summarily dismissed by the court. The measures indicated relate in practice to existing legal obligations to which Israel is already committed. As demonstrated in word and deed, Israel's war is against Hamas, not against Palestinian civilians. This is a matter of explicit government policy, military directives and procedures. It is no less an expression of Israel's core values. As stated, our commitment to uphold the law, including our obligations under international humanitarian law, is unwavering and exists independent of any ICJ proceedings and of Hamas's contempt for the law. In this context, Israel remains committed to mitigating civilian harm and to facilitating access to humanitarian aid according to the law, despite all the challenges, while also seeking to assure, as the Council noted in Resolution 2720, both its humanitarian nature and that it reaches its civilian destination and is not stolen by Hamas. Israel is continuing to work with international stakeholders to further advance this objective. Israel is also committed to preventing incitement. Like every law-abiding democracy, Israel makes rigorous efforts to draw the line between permissible statements, even those that express pain and outrage in times of crisis, and those which go beyond the limits of free speech. As Israel's Attorney General stated publicly recently, any statement calling for intentional harm to civilians contradicts the policy of the State of Israel and may amount to a criminal offense, including the offense of incitement. Several such cases are currently being examined by Israeli law enforcement authorities. And Israel also respects the role given to the ICJ for the settlement of disputes. What it does not respect is the blatant abuse of the court and its procedures by South Africa, and the unconscionable efforts to distort the truth in support of a genocidal terrorist organization at the expense of both Israelis and Palestinians, who both deserve a peaceful and prosperous future free of the death cult of Hamas. Finally, Madam President, it is quite telling that in the warped description of the court's decision by Hamas's defenders, no mention is made of the court's grave concern for the hostages and its unequivocal call for their immediate and unconditional release. Nor, of course, is mention made of the call of one of the judges for South Africa to use its warm relations with the terrorist organization to help secure the hostages' release. It is telling, but not surprising. Nothing about the description we have heard of the court's decision, nothing about this grotesque use of the ICJ, nothing about the breathless convening of this meeting of the Security Council has to do with the law. It is about distorting the facts and the law so that they can be used as a weapon, and it's an assault on the integrity of the ICJ as an institution as much as it is an assault on the truth. It should be treated by this Council accordingly. Many today have raised the issue of UNRWA and the active and direct role that employees of this UN agency played in the October 7th massacre. Israel welcomes the decision of many countries to suspend their funding to UNRWA and calls for an in-depth, independent and transparent investigation into the agency's conduct in the Gaza Strip, both regarding the involvement of UNRWA employees in the October 7th massacre and regarding the employment of Hamas operatives and the involvement of terrorist elements in its activities. Madam President, incredibly, the Security Council has convened again and again to discuss the situation, to discuss the spin and distortions of Hamas's supporters, and yet it still has been unable to condemn the massacres of October 7th by the genocidal terrorists of Hamas, their genocidal incitement, or their reprehensible terrorist strategy that causes untold suffering to both Israeli and Palestinian civilians. Until it does, this Council will fail to meet its responsibilities. It will continue to be abused as a forum where lies can be told, where the law can be manipulated to serve its greatest violators, where the victims of terrorism will feel abandoned, and where, in the words of Judge Barak at the ICJ, the crimes of Cain can be attributed to Abel. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël.
I thank the representative of Israel for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Listening there to Ambassador Jonathan Miller, Israel's Deputy Permanent Representative for the United Nations. We'll say goodnight to our SABC3 viewers, but we will leave you with the weather. We'll continue with events in New York as we continue.
An opportunity to address the Council at this briefing today. We thank the UN Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, for his briefing. This briefing and the statements of many members of the Council that we have heard this morning provides a glaring reflection of the devastating situation in Gaza and the atrocities being committed in Palestine through the targeting of civilians, civilian infrastructure, UN premises, and other vulnerable targets. The actions that we are all witnessing daily by Israel are a violation of international law, including the UN Charter, the Geneva Convention and its protocols. As South Africa has stated before, by its attacks on and kidnapping of innocent civilians, Hamas has also violated international law. Madam President, the events of the past few months in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its international law obligations, including those in terms of the Genocide Convention. South Africa has thus opted to resort to international judicial mechanisms, including at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, to seek justice for the people of Palestine. We reiterate that the international community cannot proclaim the importance of international law and the importance of the UN Charter in some situations and not in others, as if the rule of law only applies to a select few. For international law to be credible, it should be uniformly applied and not selective. Accordingly, on 29 December 2023, South Africa filed an application instituting legal proceedings at the International Court of Justice against Israel under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, with respect to the Israeli conduct in the present conflict in Gaza. The matter was heard in The Hague on 11 and 12 January 2024 in relation to the request for provisional measures. South Africa and Israel are both parties to the Genocide Convention, which has as its objective the prevention and punishment of perpetrators of the crime of genocide, which includes, in accordance with Article 3 of the Convention, genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. On 26 January 2024, the court delivered its order on South Africa's request for provisional measures, determining that Israel's action in Gaza are possibly genocidal. The court was near unanimous in its order for provisional measures, which include that Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent all acts of genocide as contained in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention and prevent and punish direct and public incitement to do so. Israel is furthermore required to take effective measures to provide urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Madam President, it is not just about more aid. It is about complete, unhindered aid. Further, Israel must ensure effective measures are taken to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure its preservation. Importantly, Israel is required to provide a report to the court on the measures it has taken to give effect to these provisional measures within 1 month. These provisional measures are directly binding on Israel, which is required pursuant to the court's order and to the Genocide Convention itself to stop all acts by it that are plausibly genocidal. There's clearly no credible basis for Israel to continue to claim that its military actions are in full compliance with international law, including the Genocide Convention, having regard to the court's ruling. Additionally, following the court's order, third states are now on notice of the existence of a serious risk of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. They must therefore also act independently and immediately to prevent genocide by Israel and to ensure that they are not themselves in violation of the Genocide Convention, including by aiding or assisting in the commission of genocide. This necessarily imposes an obligation on all states to cease funding and facilitating Israel's military actions, which are plausibly genocidal. The ICJ ruling, as read out by Judge Donahue of the United States, noted that Israel used the notion of self-defense as it attempted defense of the actions of which South Africa maintained were genocidal. The court only noted that the Israeli defense without giving it any further credence. It did not have to, as the court and the judges are well aware of its own advisory opinion in 2004 in the matter pertaining to the legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, where the court asserted that an occupying power cannot rely on Article 51 with regards to the people that it occupies. Therefore, the assertion by the representatives of the United States and Israel that the court reaffirmed the U.S. that the court reaffirmed the U.S. understanding of the issue of self-defense is not accurate. Madam President, the decision by the court marks a decisive victory for the international rule of law and a significant milestone in the search for justice for the Palestinian people. The court's decision also affirms the importance of global governance institutions, including organs of the United Nations. It remains vital for all member states to respect and implement the decisions of the court. Hopefully, it will provide a new impetus to the search for a lasting political solution, peace and stability in the Middle East. South Africa sincerely hopes that Israel will not act to frustrate the application of this order, as it has publicly threatened to do so, but that it will instead act to comply with it fully, as it is bound to do so. Unfortunately, in the days since the court's decision, we have seen the Israeli government continue its illegal actions in violation of the court order. South Africa will continue to act within institutions of global governance to protect the rights, including the fundamental right to life, of Palestinians in Gaza, which continue to remain at urgent risk, including from Israeli military assault, starvation and disease, and to obtain the fair and equal application of international law to all in the interest of our collective humanity. Notably, South Africa will continue to do everything within its power to preserve the existence of the Palestinian people as a group, to end all acts of apartheid and genocide against the Palestinian people, and to work with them to the realization of collective right to self-determination. South Africa welcomes the support expressed by several countries, and we encourage states that are so inclined to approach the court to intervene in the proceedings so as to send a strong message to the international community that the situation in Gaza Strip is indefensible. Madam President, South Africa has noted with great concern the allegations by Israel that 12 UNRWA staff members were involved in October 7 attacks. We welcome the announcement by the Secretary General that the United Nations is taking swift action following the allegations, and that an investigation by the UN's Office of International Oversight was immediately activated. We are extremely concerned by the announcement by various countries of their intention to withdraw humanitarian funding to UNRWA following the accusations. South Africa supports the call by the UN Secretary General for the countries that have decided to withdraw or pause their funding for UNRWA to reconsider their decision. UNRWA has been providing life-saving humanitarian assistance to Palestinians for decades. Withdrawing funding from UNRWA will worsen an already dire and complex humanitarian situation. South Africa appeals to those countries to reconsider their decisions. In conclusion, Madam President, South Africa would like to repeat what it stated a few days ago in this chamber. War is never wise. When the use of force is utilized anywhere in the world, irrespective of whether it is lawful or unlawful, the laws of war must be applied, and civilians must be protected. This Council must fulfill its mandate and focus its efforts on enforcing peace. I thank you.
Je remercie la...
I thank the representative of South Africa for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers.
All right, and there you have it, the very latest from the United Nations Security Council, those presentations given by a raft of countries, kicking things off with the situation as encapsulated by UNRWA in terms of the humanitarian coordination effort. A grim picture being painted of the catastrophe that's unfolding on the ground. You also heard Riyad Mansour, who is the permanent observer for the state of Israel, give his, for the state of Palestine, share his rearview mirror perspective on what's been happening on the ground in Gaza after 115 days, he said. Abhorrent and criminal war in the Gaza Strip continues. 26,000 Palestinians killed in terrifying circumstances. 2.3 million people going through hell every single day, and this hell will haunt them for the rest of their days. Hearing there also from Ambassador Jonathan Miller, who's Israel's deputy permanent representative for the United Nations, kicking off with the concept of a lie being perpetuated 1,000 times, still being a lie, and defending their position of this still being a matter of libel insofar as the charge of genocide is concerned. So quite a range of perspectives there and a polarity of views in the United Nations Security Council. How is this all bound to play out? Let's bring in our international news editor, Sophie McQueen, and we'll be joined in just a moment from the UN by our US correspondent, Sherwin Bryce Peace. So, Sophie, thanks again for staying with us and for watching as these proceedings have unfolded. Just bring together different elements that we've heard from various countries making their statements and their submissions in the aftermath of that ICJ provisional ruling, and their perception of how you actually get to enforce what they've called for.
Well, clearly, those who are supporting Palestine are insisting that there must be a ceasefire. And you had the representative from South Africa pointing out that the obligation is on Israel to ensure that the implementation of these orders does happen, and you can only do that when there's ceasefire. The same with Algeria. Algeria very strong, also saying that implement the measures that have been communicated by the International Court of Justice, and you can only do that when there's ceasefire. You have, on the other hand, the United States of America saying that ceasefire is something that should not be an option, particularly in relation to hunting Hamas and ensuring that you do away with their capability. But accepting that what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza, is very bad, and that you have to ensure that there's aid that's being delivered to Gaza. But how do you do it when there's bombardment, when there's fighting? And therefore, when there are people who are blocking the trucks. And on the other hand, you also have Palestine, very, very strong, talking about how they feel. And I think what was presented by a Palestinian representative speaks to how Palestinians feel at the moment and for years. On the other hand, we have Israel tracking this issue from the 7th of October during that massacre, and saying that it should be Hamas who is facing genocide allegations and charges rather than Israel, because Israel is defending itself. But the other argument is that within the international law, when you engage in war, there are rules, and you have to respect the rules. One rule that is sacrosanct: you cannot kill civilians. If you do it, it must be very, very minimum. You can't talk about 26,000 people that we have killed and think that it does comply with the rules of engagement in relation to war. And also the other parties emphasizing that the genocide must be prevented. And we know that the Genocide Convention put the responsibility on all member countries who are signatories to the Genocide Convention to protect and prevent. You have to prevent. It doesn't even have to happen and then you act. You have to prevent. If you see the signs, you have to do something. So again, divergent views there as we anticipated. And I think Sherwin can sum it much better in terms of his sense of what transpired today and where to from here.
Sherwin, well, let me bring you in then, and I want to go to what we heard in the submissions tonight. 30 member states voting for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, 153 member states supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. Given that backdrop of support, but at the same time, given the support that Israel has in the UNSC, and what the US ambassador said tonight, saying the confidence in UNRWA has been shaken up, and citing the fact that the UN is now going to do a cleaning up, so to speak, of those who are bona fides and those who aren't. Is there likely to be any difference in the outcome here at the UNSC?
Probably not is probably the short answer, Iman. But I think, in summary of all the interventions you heard from the 15 members of the UN Security Council, the state of Palestine, the state of Israel, and then the Republic of South Africa, was an affirmation of the ICJ's importance here, the validity of the court's provisional measures. I don't think you heard from any member state a rejection or an outright rejection of what the court has pronounced itself on. You might have heard different interpretations of what the meaning of the provisional measures might be. But certainly broad consensus here that the ICJ must be respected and that its provisional measures are certainly binding. What you did catalytically here in terms of what might happen now, right? They've all gone into consultations. The Algerians and the Palestinians will be presenting a draft resolution on an immediate permanent ceasefire. But critically, you heard from Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador, that the conditions to sustain a ceasefire do not currently exist, and she was pointing to diplomatic efforts. You will know that the state of Qatar, Egypt, France, the United States and Israel have been engaged in separate negotiations in terms of a new hostage deal that could see an up to 2-month pause or a cessation of hostilities for about 2 months, and tranches of hostages then released during that period. She didn't want to get into too many details details in terms of the nuts and bolts of that discussion, but there are certainly parallel processes, and we've talked a lot about these parallel processes in the more than 3 months that this war has been unfolding, and you see these diplomatic efforts happening in the region, while there is a broad emphasis, certainly led by the Palestinian envoy, that the Security Council must act here in terms of affirming the provisional measures. I don't want to use the word enforcement, because enforcing something that is already legally binding is a misnomer, Iman. But certainly there is a contingent within that Security Council that believes that some action needs to be taken by the Council to give effect to the provisional measures, the stopping, in terms of the stopping the killing of Palestinian civilians. We talk about the harm in terms of mental health and physical health of Palestinians, and the need for greater humanitarian access. We haven't seen Israel change its posture in the days since that ICJ ruling. They have to present a report in 1 month on the implementation, but the argument here is in the absence of Israel adhering to the prescripts of the ICJ, what is the role of the Security Council in that regard? And so you'll now see this push and pull within those consultations behind closed doors. On the one hand, countries will push for a humanitarian resolution, and you will hear from the countries like the United States, possibly supported by the United Kingdom, that the measures or the conditions for a pause, a cessation in hostilities, does not currently exist, Iman.
Well, let's wrap it in 20. How quickly is that going to happen? It's not going to happen immediately. There are now going to be consultations. There will be negotiations on a possible text. But I think the United States has spelt it out very clearly that they are not in support of a cessation of hostilities right now. They believe Israel has the right to self-defense. They believe the courts, the ICJ's ruling, affirm that position. They did not call for an immediate ceasefire. And so the United States will hide behind that language while it pursues its own hostage and ceasefire deal in the region. With the Qataris, the Egyptians, the French, and the Israelis, Iman. Thank you very much. Our U.S. correspondent, Sharon Bryce Peace, watching developments there at the United Nations in New York. Sophie Mokoena, our international news editor, here with me in Johannesburg. Thank the pair of you for your time tonight, and we will keep you posted on this matter of international importance.